The sound of sirens cuts through the peaceful afternoon air like a knife through butter. I am standing in my backyard, watching two police officers climb out of their patrol car, their expressions serious and businesslike. Behind them, a red-faced teenager is pointing directly at me, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch as he shouts about how I have illegally locked him out of what he claims is a public space. The officers look genuinely confused, their eyes darting between the furious boy and my calm demeanor as I stand by my pool gate, keys still in hand. The teenager continues his tirade, insisting that this pool has always been available to the neighborhood, that his mother told him it was community property, and that I have no right to prevent him from using it. One of the officers steps forward, clearly trying to make sense of the situation, and asks me directly if this is indeed a shared amenity. Without saying a word, I reach into my back pocket and pull out a folded document that I have been carrying with me ever since this nightmare began. I hand it to the officer with steady hands, watching as his eyebrows raise slightly when he sees the official seal at the top of the page. The deed to my property is clear and unmistakable, showing that this house, this yard, and this pool belong to me and me alone. There is no mention of community access, no easements, no shared responsibilities. The officer studies the document carefully, then looks back at the teenager whose confident expression is starting to crack around the edges. This is the moment I've been waiting for, the moment when the truth finally comes to light after months of harassment and intimidation. But let me start from the beginning, because this story goes back much further than today's dramatic confrontation. 6 months ago, I was a single mother living in a cramped apartment with my 8-year-old daughter Emma, dreaming of the day when we could have our own space, our own yard, maybe even our own pool. Life had been a constant struggle since my divorce, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet, but I had been saving every penny I could, hoping that someday we would find our perfect home. That day came sooner than I expected when my real estate agent called me about a foreclosure property in Maplewood Estates, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house had been on the market for months, and the bank was eager to sell. It was a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and best of all, a gorgeous in-ground pool in the backyard. The price was within my budget, barely, but it felt like a miracle. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw that pool, and I knew we had found our new home. The paperwork went through quickly, and within a month we were moving in. The previous owner had been part of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, but my lawyer assured me that since the house had gone into foreclosure, all previous agreements had lapsed. The HOA had actually dissolved several years earlier anyway, when too many residents had stopped paying their dues. This meant that while I was buying into a neighborhood with certain aesthetic standards, I was not bound by any community agreements or shared amenities. Everything seemed perfect for the first few weeks. Emma loved having her own room, and I enjoyed sitting by the pool in the evenings after work, watching her splash around happily. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving when they saw us and welcoming us to the area. I thought we had finally found our peaceful little corner of the world, a place where Emma could grow up safely, and I could rebuild my life after the chaos of divorce. But then I met Karen Whitmore, the woman who lived 3 houses down from us. She was in her mid-40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of authority that suggested she was used to getting her way. She appeared at my front door one Saturday morning, accompanied by her 15-year-old son Derek, a lanky teenager with an entitled expression that immediately put me on edge. Karen introduced herself as the unofficial neighborhood coordinator, a role she had apparently given herself after the HOA disbanded. She explained that the pool had always been considered a neighborhood amenity, something that all the residents could enjoy during the summer months. According to Karen, the previous owner had been happy to share the pool with everyone, especially the teenagers who needed a place to cool off during the hot summer days. She suggested that I continue this tradition, framing it as a way to integrate myself into the community and build relationships with my new neighbors. I was polite but firm in my response, explaining that I had purchased the property specifically for the privacy and that the pool was not part of any community agreement. I had reviewed all the paperwork carefully, and there was no mention of shared access or community rights. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her friendly demeanor, suggesting that perhaps I had misunderstood the neighborhood dynamics and that I should consider the feelings of the other residents. Derek said nothing during this conversation, but but I could see him eyeing the pool through the sliding glass door, clearly disappointed that his summer plans were being disrupted. Karen assured me that the kids were all well behaved and that they would be respectful of my property, but I held my ground. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I was not about to turn it into a public recreational facility. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Derek and a few other teenagers lingering around my property, always seeming to find excuses to walk past my backyard fence. At first, I assumed they were just curious about the new neighbors, but then I started finding wet footprints on my deck and towels left behind on my pool furniture. It became clear that they were sneaking into my yard when I was not home, treating my pool as their personal playground. I decided to address this directly with Karen, calling her to explain what was happening and ask her to speak with Derek about respecting my property. Her response was dismissive and almost condescending, suggesting that I was being unreasonable and that the pool had always been available to the neighborhood children. She reminded me that I was new to the area and that I should try to be more understanding of the established traditions. When I mentioned that there were no legal agreements requiring me to share my pool, Karen's tone became noticeably cooler. She implied that I was being selfish and that my attitude was causing problems in the neighborhood. She suggested that if I was not willing to be a good neighbor, perhaps I should have bought a house somewhere else. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, leaving me frustrated and angry. The trespassing incidents continued and even escalated. Derek and his friends seemed to view my requests for privacy as a personal challenge, sneaking into my yard at all hours and leaving behind evidence of their presence. I found beer cans hidden behind my pool equipment, cigarette butts in my flower beds, and even graffiti on my fence. When I called Karen to report these incidents, she denied that Derek was involved and accused me of trying to cause trouble for innocent children. The situation came to a head one evening when I came home from work to find Derek and 3 of his friends having a pool party in my backyard. They had somehow managed to get through my gate, and they were acting as if they owned the place. When I confronted them, Derek actually had the audacity to tell me that his mother had given him permission to use the pool and that I had no right to kick them out. I ordered all of them to leave immediately, and while the other boys seemed embarrassed and quickly gathered their things, Derek stood his ground. He argued with me for several minutes, insisting that the pool was community property and that I was violating neighborhood agreements by trying to restrict access. Only when I threatened to call the police did he finally leave, but not before making it clear that this was not over. The next morning, I installed a heavy-duty lock on my pool gate and put up several no trespassing signs around my property. I also called a security company to discuss installing cameras, though I was hoping the lock would be enough to solve the problem. I naively thought that a clear physical barrier would send the message that my property was private and off-limits. Instead, Karen launched what could only be described as a social media campaign against me. She flooded the neighborhood Facebook group with posts about community rights and selfish homeowners who refused to share amenities that had always been available to everyone. She twisted the facts, claiming that I was trying to monopolize resources that belonged to the entire neighborhood and that I was creating division where there had once been harmony. The posts were carefully crafted to avoid mentioning me by name, but it was obvious to everyone who she was talking about. She painted herself as the defender of neighborhood traditions and portrayed me as an outsider who was trying to destroy the close-knit community that had existed for years. Some of the comments were supportive of her position, with other parents expressing concern about losing access to the pool for their children. But not everyone was convinced by Karen's version of events. Several neighbors reached out to me privately, expressing their support and apologizing for the harassment I was experiencing. They explained that Karen had always been domineering and that she had a history of trying to control neighborhood activities even after the HOA had dissolved. These conversations were reassuring, but they did not solve the underlying problem. The lock on my gate seemed to be working for a few days, but then I discovered that Derek had found a way to climb over the fence. I came home one afternoon to find him in the pool again, this time alone. When I confronted him, he claimed that he had left something behind during his last visit and that he was just retrieving it. The explanation was obviously false, but he maintained his innocent expression throughout our conversation. I told Derek in no uncertain terms that he was trespassing and that if I found him on my property again, I would call the police. He seemed unimpressed by this threat, shrugging his shoulders and suggesting that I was overreacting. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, he made a comment that chilled me to the bone, saying that I would regret trying to keep him away from what was rightfully his. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Derek's words and the way Karen had been rallying the neighborhood against me. I had bought this house to create a safe haven for Emma and myself, but instead I felt like I was under siege. The stress was affecting my work performance, and Emma was starting to ask questions about why some of the neighbors seemed angry with us. I decided to take action and contacted a lawyer to review my property deed and confirm my rights. The attorney was very clear that the pool was entirely my property and that I had no legal obligation to share it with anyone. He also explained that the dissolution of the HOA had eliminated any previous agreements about shared amenities, assuming such agreements had ever existed in the first place. Armed with this legal confirmation, I felt more confident about standing my ground. I also decided to install the security cameras I had been considering, positioning them to monitor my backyard and pool area. The cameras would not only provide evidence if there were future trespassing incidents, but they would also serve as a deterrent to anyone thinking about entering my property uninvited. The very next morning, my new security system paid for itself. I was getting ready for work when I received an alert on my phone that motion had been detected in my backyard. I checked the camera feed and saw Derek swimming in my pool, apparently having climbed over the fence again. This time, however, I had video evidence of his trespassing. I immediately went outside to confront him, bringing my phone with me so I could record our interaction. Derek was startled to see me, clearly not expecting me to be home at that hour. When I told him he was trespassing and needed to leave, he became defensive and argumentative, insisting that he had every right to be there. His tone was disrespectful and entitled, showing no recognition that he was on my private property without permission. I remained calm but firm, explaining that this was my property and that he was not welcome. I also mentioned that I had video evidence of his trespassing and that I would be sharing it with the authorities if necessary. Derek's demeanor changed slightly at this threat, but he still maintained his defiant attitude as he climbed out of the pool and gathered his belongings. As he prepared to leave, Derek made another comment that revealed just how twisted his understanding of the situation had become. He told me that his mother had explained that the pool belonged to the whole neighborhood and that I was just trying to steal it for myself. He seemed genuinely convinced that he was the victim in this situation and that I was the one behaving badly. I watched Derek leave through my front gate, but I had a feeling this was not the end of our confrontation. His anger was obvious, and I suspected that he would run straight to his mother to report what had happened. I decided to take a screenshot of the security footage and save the video file, just in case I needed evidence later. Less than an hour later, I was proven right about Derek's intentions. As I was getting in my car to leave for work, I saw 2 police cruisers turning onto my street, their lights flashing but sirens silent. My heart began to race as I realized they were headed toward my house. I quickly parked and walked back to my front door, wondering what could possibly be happening. The officers got out of their cars and approached me, their expressions professional but serious. Behind them, I could see Derek standing on the sidewalk, his face flushed with excitement and righteous indignation. One of the officers introduced himself and explained that they had received a 911 call about a property dispute and someone being illegally prevented from accessing a community pool. Derek immediately launched into his version of events, speaking rapidly and gesturing wildly as he described how I had locked him out of the neighborhood pool and threatened him with cameras and police. He painted me as an aggressive and unreasonable person who was trying to steal community property for my own selfish use. His story was passionate and detailed, clearly something he had rehearsed during his sprint home to call for help. The officers listened politely to Derek's account, then turned to me for my side of the story. I remained calm and composed, explaining that this was my private property and that Derek had been trespassing repeatedly despite my request for him to stay away. I mentioned that I had video evidence of his unauthorized entry and that I had been dealing with this problem for weeks. One of the officers asked if I had any documentation to prove my ownership of the property and the pool. This was the moment I had been preparing for, and I reached into my back pocket to pull out the folded copy of my property deed that I had been carrying with me since the lawyer's consultation. I handed it to the officer, watching as he studied the official document carefully. The deed was clear and unambiguous, showing that the house and all associated structures, including the pool, were my private property. There was no mention of community access, shared amenities, or any other arrangement that would give Derek or anyone else the right to use my pool. The officer's expression changed as he read the document, and I could see him beginning to understand the true nature of the situation. While the first officer was reviewing my deed, the second officer was using his tablet to pull up municipal records and property information. He was able to confirm that the HOA had indeed been dissolved several years earlier, and that there were no current agreements or easements that would grant community access to my pool. The digital records matched exactly what my lawyer had told me about the legal status of my property. Derek's confident expression began to waver as he watched the officers examining the evidence. He started to interrupt, insisting that the documents must be wrong and that his mother had told him the pool was public property. The officers asked him to remain quiet while they completed their investigation, but Derek continued to fidget nervously, clearly realizing that his story was falling apart. At that moment, Karen herself appeared on the scene, having apparently been alerted by Derek or one of the neighbors who had noticed the police cars. She marched up to the group with her characteristic air of authority, immediately demanding to know why the officers were harassing her son. Her arrival changed the entire dynamic of the situation, and I could see that she was prepared for a fight. Karen launched into her own version of events, speaking over Derek and addressing the officers as if she were in charge of the situation. She claimed that the pool had always been a neighborhood amenity and that I was trying to steal community property through legal technicalities. Her tone was condescending and dismissive, suggesting that the officers were being manipulated by my paperwork and that they should focus on the real issue of community rights. The officer holding my deed looked up at Karen with a measured expression, then held up the document for her to see. He explained that the property deed clearly established my ownership of the pool and that there were no legal agreements requiring me to share it with the neighborhood. He also mentioned that the municipal records confirmed the dissolution of the HOA and the absence of any current community access rights. Karen's face went through a series of expressions as the reality of the situation sank in. First, there was confusion, as if she could not believe what she was hearing. Then came anger, as she realized that her version of events was being contradicted by official documents. Finally, there was something that looked almost like fear, as she began to understand the legal implications of what Derek had been doing. The officer continued his explanation, noting that Derek had been trespassing on my property repeatedly and that I had been more than patient in trying to resolve the situation through informal means. He pointed out that calling 911 for a non-emergency property dispute was a misuse of emergency services, especially when the caller was actually the one in the wrong. Karen tried to argue that she had been misinformed about the legal status of the pool, but the officer was not sympathetic to her claims of ignorance. He explained that property ownership was a matter of public record and that she should have verified the facts before encouraging her son to use someone else's pool. Her attempts to shift, blame, and maintain her authority were met with professional but firm responses from both officers. Derek stood silently during this exchange. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He seemed to be realizing for the first time that his mother's assurances about community rights had been wrong and that he had been trespassing all along. The weight of his actions was clearly settling on his shoulders, and he looked increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation continued. The officer then turned to Derek and explained that he could face juvenile charges for trespassing and for making a false police report. He warned that any future incidents would be taken much more seriously, and that Derek needed to understand that my property was completely off-limits. The stern tone of this warning seemed to have a significant impact on the teenager, who nodded repeatedly and mumbled an apology. Karen was issued a formal warning for encouraging trespassing and for misuse of emergency services. The officer made it clear that any future incidents involving her or her son would result in immediate charges and that she needed to ensure Derek understood the boundaries of my property. The warning was delivered in front of several neighbors who had gathered to watch the commotion, making Karen's humiliation complete and public. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them handed me a case number and explained that I should contact them immediately if there were any future problems. He also recommended that I document any additional incidents and suggested that I might want to consider increasing my security measures if the harassment continued. The professional support was reassuring, and I felt vindicated after months of frustration and stress. I watched Karen and Derek walk back to their house, both of them looking defeated and embarrassed. The contrast between their earlier confidence and their current deflated state was striking. Several neighbors who had witnessed the entire confrontation approached me to express their support and to apologize for the trouble I had experienced. Their encouragement was welcome, but I was mainly just relieved that the truth had finally come to light. The next few days were blissfully quiet. Derek was nowhere to be seen, and Karen seemed to be avoiding any contact with me or my property. The neighborhood Facebook group also became much more peaceful, with Karen's posts about community rights mysteriously disappearing. I began to hope that the police intervention had finally put an end to the harassment and that Emma and I could enjoy our pool in peace. 2 weeks later, I found a letter in my mailbox that I had not been expecting. It was handwritten on expensive stationery and signed by someone I had never met before. The letter was from Karen's husband, David Whitmore, and it contained a formal apology for the behavior of his wife and son. He explained that he had been unaware of the extent of the harassment I had been experiencing and that he was mortified by their actions. David's letter revealed several important details about the situation that I had not known before. He confirmed that the HOA had been dissolved years earlier and that there had never been any community access rights to my pool. He also admitted that Karen had been aware of these facts but had chosen to ignore them because she was upset about losing what she considered to be a neighborhood amenity. The apology letter also included a request that I not pursue any legal action against Karen or Derek, emphasizing that they had learned their lesson and would not cause any future problems. David promised that he would personally ensure that Derek stayed away from my property and that Karen would not engage in any further harassment or social media campaigns against me. I was surprised by the letter's humble tone and the obvious embarrassment it contained. It was clear that David had been forced to confront the reality of his family's behavior and that he was trying to make amends for their actions. The letter felt sincere, and I appreciated the effort he had made to reach out and apologize. However, I was not willing to simply forget about everything that had happened. The months of harassment and stress had taken a toll on both Emma and me, and I wanted to ensure that we would not face any future problems. I decided to take additional steps to protect my property and my peace of mind. First, I installed a taller fence around my backyard, one that would be much more difficult for anyone to climb over. The new fence was 8 feet tall and included privacy slats that would prevent people from looking into my yard. I also added motion-activated lights around the perimeter, which would deter any nighttime trespassing attempts. I also expanded my security camera system, adding additional cameras to monitor all approaches to my property. The new system included night vision capabilities and would send alerts to my phone whenever motion was detected. I wanted to be absolutely certain that I would know if anyone tried to enter my property without permission. The enhanced security measures gave me peace of mind, but they also sent a clear message to the neighborhood that I was serious about protecting my property and my family's privacy. Some neighbors commented on the new fence and cameras, but most were supportive of my decision to increase security after everything that had happened. Mrs. Plankbite. Henderson from next door even mentioned that she wished she had installed similar security after her own problems with teenagers cutting through her yard. The installation process took several days, during which I had the opportunity to speak with many neighbors who stopped by to see what was happening. These conversations revealed just how much damage Karen's social media campaign had actually caused. Several people admitted that they had initially believed her version of events because she had presented it so convincingly, complete with references to neighborhood traditions and community agreements that sounded official but were entirely fabricated. Mr. Peterson, an elderly gentleman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, was particularly apologetic about the situation. He explained that when the original HOA had been active, there had never been any shared pool arrangements. Each homeowner had always been responsible for their own amenities, and the idea of community access to private pools had never even been discussed. Karen had apparently invented this entire concept to justify her son's behavior. The revelation that Karen had been deliberately spreading false information made me even more grateful for the legal documentation I had gathered. Without the property deed and municipal records, her convincing lies might have continued to influence neighborhood opinion. The police intervention had not only resolved the immediate problem, but had also exposed the truth to everyone who had been misled by Karen's manipulation. Karen and Derek seemed to get the message as well. I occasionally saw them around the neighborhood, but they made no attempt to approach me or my property. Karen's social media posts remained focused on other topics, and Derek appeared to be spending his summer elsewhere. The harassment had clearly ended, and I was finally able to enjoy my pool without worry. However, I noticed that Karen's online presence had changed significantly, with far fewer posts and much less engagement from other neighbors. Several people mentioned to me that Karen had become increasingly isolated after the police incident. Her attempts to maintain her role as neighborhood coordinator had been undermined by the exposure of her dishonesty, and many residents were now questioning other claims she had made about community issues. The social dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted dramatically, and Karen's influence had been permanently damaged. Derek's behavior had also changed noticeably. When I occasionally saw him around the neighborhood, he would quickly look away and avoid any eye contact. His previous swagger and entitlement had been replaced by obvious embarrassment and shame. The reality of his actions and their consequences seemed to have had a profound impact on him, and I hoped that the experience would serve as a valuable lesson about respecting other people's property and rights. The security cameras proved to be an excellent investment beyond their intended purpose. They provided me with detailed footage of wildlife in my backyard, including a family of deer that visited regularly and various birds that I had never noticed before. Emma was fascinated by the nighttime videos, and we began to make a game of identifying different animals that appeared on the recordings. More importantly, the cameras gave me complete peace of mind when I was away from home. I could check the feeds from my phone at any time and verify that my property was secure. The motion alerts allowed me to monitor activity around my house, and I was pleased to see that there were no unauthorized visitors after the fence and camera installation. The new fence also provided additional benefits that I had not anticipated. The privacy slats created a much more intimate atmosphere in my backyard, making it feel like a true private retreat. Emma and I could swim and relax without feeling like we were being watched by curious neighbors, and the increased privacy made the pool area much more enjoyable for both of us. Emma was thrilled to have unrestricted access to the pool again, and she spent countless hours swimming and playing in the water. The stress of the past few months seemed to melt away as we settled into a routine of peaceful summer evenings by the pool. I had finally achieved the sanctuary I had been seeking when I bought the house, and the contrast between our current tranquility and the previous chaos was remarkable. We began hosting small pool parties for Emma's friends from school, something I'd been reluctant to do during the height of the harassment. These gatherings were wonderful opportunities for Emma to socialize, and for me to meet other parents in a relaxed setting. The children were always respectful of our property and grateful for the invitation, which made me even more aware of how inappropriate Derek's behavior had been. The pool parties also served as a subtle way of demonstrating to the neighborhood that our pool was thriving as a private family space. Other parents would comment on how beautiful the backyard looked and how well-maintained the pool was, reinforcing the fact that this was clearly a personal residence rather than a community facility. These positive interactions helped to further cement the truth about my property ownership. Some neighbors still whispered about the incident when they thought I could not hear them, but most had moved on to other topics. The dramatic police intervention had made it clear to everyone that I was the rightful owner of the pool and that Karen's claims about community rights had been false. The truth had prevailed, and that was all that mattered to me. However, I occasionally heard fragments of conversations that suggested some people were still processing the full implications of Karen's deception. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 blocks away, stopped by one evening to apologize for her initial skepticism about my position. She admitted that Karen's posts had been so detailed and convincing that she had assumed there must be some truth to them. The revelation that Karen had fabricated the entire narrative about community pool access had shocked many residents who had considered her a trusted source of neighborhood information. The incident had also prompted several neighbors to review their own property deeds and HOA documents, wanting to ensure they understood their rights and responsibilities. This increased awareness of property law and community agreements was probably a positive outcome of the entire situation, as it would help prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. I learned from Mr. Peterson that Karen had approached several other neighbors about various community issues over the years, always presenting herself as an expert on neighborhood regulations and property rights. With the benefit of hindsight, many residents were now questioning whether her previous claims had been accurate, or whether she had been operating from her own misguided assumptions about how the neighborhood should function. The pool stayed locked and remained peaceful, exactly as I had always intended it to be. Emma and I had finally found our safe haven, and no amount of neighborhood drama could take that away from us. The letter from David Whitmore remained in my desk drawer, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. Every time I looked at that letter, I was reminded of how crucial it had been to document everything and to remain firm in my convictions, despite the social pressure and harassment. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about property ownership, community dynamics, and the importance of knowing your legal rights. I'd also learned that sometimes the most convincing arguments can be based on completely false premises, and that official documentation is essential when dealing with disputes about property and legal obligations. The months of stress and conflict had been difficult, but they had ultimately strengthened my resolve and my confidence in handling challenging situations. As autumn approached and the pool season began to wind down, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that first confrontation with Karen and Derek. The backyard that had once been a source of anxiety and conflict had become our peaceful sanctuary, exactly as I had envisioned when I first saw the property. Emma had grown more confident and outgoing, no longer worried about neighborhood tensions affecting her ability to enjoy her own home. The security system had recorded countless hours of footage over the summer, documenting not just the absence of trespassers, but also the gradual return of wildlife to our yard. Apparently, the previous chaos and constant human activity had driven away many of the birds and small animals that now felt safe enough to return. Emma delighted in watching the recordings each morning, creating a nature journal to track the different species we observed. One particularly satisfying moment came when I noticed Karen walking past our house with a group of visiting relatives, clearly trying to show off the neighborhood. I was sitting by the pool with Emma, and I could see Karen glancing longingly at our beautiful backyard setup. The contrast between her current diminished status and her previous attempts to control community resources was not lost on me, and I felt a quiet sense of vindication watching her explain to her guests why she could no longer access what she had once claimed was a shared amenity. The final proof of how completely the situation had been resolved came when David Whitmore approached me at the grocery store one evening. He seemed genuinely embarrassed but determined to speak with me face to face. He thanked me for not pursuing legal action against his family and mentioned that the experience had been a wake-up call for both Karen and Derek about the importance of respecting other people's property and rights. David also revealed that Karen had been required to seek counseling as part of their family's effort to address the underlying issues that had led to the harassment. He admitted that his wife had always struggled with control issues and had difficulty accepting when things did not go her way. The pool situation had been a manifestation of deeper problems that they were now working to address through professional help. Most importantly, David assured me that Derek had learned valuable lessons about accountability and consequences. The teenager had been required to write apology letters to several neighbors who had been affected by the social media campaign, and he was now volunteering at a local community center as part of his effort to make amends for his behavior. The experience had apparently been transformative for him, teaching him about the importance of honesty and respect for others. As I locked the pool cover in place for the winter season, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction and peace. The clear blue water reflected the autumn sky, and the surrounding deck furniture looked inviting even in the cooler weather. This space had become everything I had hoped for when I first bought the house, a private retreat where Emma and I could create happy memories without interference from entitled neighbors or fabricated community obligations.